Welcome to the Missions Podcast, the show that explores your hard questions on missions, theology, and practice to help goers think and thinkers go. I'm Alex Kochman, Director of Advancement and Communications with ABWE International, joined by my partner in crime, live from Cedarville University. I keep saying this, we're live. They're not live. It's live, we're in the present.
You've said that more than once.
I've said that every time, and probably our listeners have been hearing that for days and weeks now on end, and so they're getting tired of me saying that. But you're Scott Dunford.
I am.
You are the West Coast Advancement Coordinator for ABWE and the pastor of Redeemer Church in Fremont, California.
Yes, at the time of the recording, all of those things are true.
That
will remain
currently. It might change. It might change. Let's rescue this interview real quick and talk to our friend Dan DeWitt. You guys go way back. Yeah. Dan, why don't you introduce yourself? You've got a long and impressive resume, so I don't want to botch it. And you're here at Cedarville.
So I'm a professor at Cedarville. I'm in my sixth year at Cedarville. So I've been here for a few years. Before that, I taught at Southern Seminary, which is where Scott and I met. The Southern Baptist Theological Seminary.
And where my daughter's a student at the school you were once
That's
the dean
right,
of,
at Boyce College. Yeah. And so I live here with my wife. Obviously, that always sounds weird when you set it up that way. But my wife and I have been married for 20 years. We have 4 kids, Isaiah, Micah, Josiah, and Addie, 14, 10, and 8. And we go to a local church, Dayton Avenue Baptist Church. We've been members there since we got here. And we love it. Yeah. So.
I can tell you've been out of Southern a long time, since your apparel is now out of.
Yes.
That T-shirt isn't from the Southern collection.
No, it's not. No,
that's okay.
I couldn't fit a pocket hanky in this little pocket.
I've always appreciated your ability to be comfortable while looking sharp, Dan.
Yeah, I could dumb down the dress code wherever I go.
So one of the things that you and I have
Speaking of dumbing things down, let's dive in.
So one of the things that I feel like you and I always have connected over is our love of 2 writers, particularly G.K. Chesterton, and then of course.
That allowed?
It is allowed, yes.
Sure.
Yes, and the other one who most people will really love is C.S. Lewis. And you've probably thought more about C.S. Lewis than anyone I know. And as I think about missions, and we've even talked about the need for apologetics in missions, but especially apologetics that fit the culture and help identify where people are at. Certainly C.S. Lewis was speaking at a time and place in history, and especially in Western history and culture. But he had a unique ability to say deep theological things in a way that children can know and feel, but even like as an adult, I can go back and read these children's books and his theological and philosophical works, and it doesn't just hit my head, it hits my heart in a unique way that just moves me. So I would love to just kind of tee you up to talk about that. What is the role of apologetics? How does C.S. Lewis help us think through apologetics, so to speak? And how could that help us, even as our missionaries, as we're trying to think about how to reach these lost people around us?
Yeah, C.S. Lewis was great at translating theology into everyday language. And so his book, Mere Christianity, first a series of radio talks, which means he had to think about his audience. I think Dorothy Sayers, around that time frame, cited a statistic in one of her writings that the vast majority of British soldiers didn't know what the meaning of Easter was. And so here's C.S. Lewis speaking to them and translating Christian beliefs into a way that everybody could relate to it. And Lewis would even say that should be a requirement for those going into ministry. Lewis argued that someone at their ordination should have to translate something from church history into common vernacular to prove that they're able to do that. And I think sometimes if we reinstituted that, how many people would have to think long and hard about how they're going to do just that, translate theology into everyday language. It's easy to get up and use a bunch of $25 academic words, and Lewis could do that. But I think for so many, what makes Lewis timeless is that translation part. And that applies to missions, since often you're translating it into another language, but at a deeper level than that, you're translating big ideas into accessible ideas, and you're showing them the touch point where theology's touching their lives, where they can have a reference point to start making sense of the claims of the Christian faith.
Part of the project that Lewis is a part of, and the Inklings, all of them together are doing, is they're drawing upon the riches of the Western cultural past and Anglo-Saxon culture and all those sorts of things, and they're re-enchanting that. And I mean that in the literal sense, right? Like singing into it, in this magical sense. They're re-enchanting it, right, for their age. We're always thinking about the intersection of timeless truth and culture. on a podcast like the Missions Podcast. So how should a missionary seek to draw upon the best of those types of cultural riches, whether it's in the West, if we're trying to be missionaries here in the West among our contemporaries, or whether I'm elsewhere and maybe I want to look back and see kind of the common graces that God has woven into that culture over time. Does that serve the gospel? Is that not helpful to the gospel, right? Is it Christ against culture or what there? How should we unpack that? And maybe how is Lewis a model for doing that well?
Well, I think Lewis models for us in his apologetics really a diverse use of methods. And so Lewis wasn't dogmatically committed to any particular methodology, but you could see certain stark contrast in his methods in terms of during World War II, it was clearly mere Christianity, and it was very straightforward. And it makes me think of Lewis's book, The Problem of Pain, in which he says that pain is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world. That there's a time for this really direct, although clear and concise, but direct apologetic of sharing the Christian faith. And then after, it was in Lewis's later years, they started writing the Narnia stories. And I think a lot of that's born out of this kind of post-war apathy. When we're not being, when there's not pressure on us and we start to not pay as much attention to what's going on in the world around us and what's going on inside of us, we can ignore those direct messages. In fact, they kind of become ambient noise, and they're quite easy to ignore. And so I think what Lewis did then is he wanted to, as he described it, steal past watchful dragons. And he described our ready-made rational defenses. I don't believe that as these dragons. And so what you have to do is find an inroad around those watchful dragons. And Lewis did that through the imagination. And so his Narnia stories introduced Aslan, this type of Christ in the stories, to a lot of people who at first the meaning of the message was lost on them. And then for many, they slowly...
Which is hard for me to believe.
Yeah, that's right.
It's a little on the nose.
Yeah, I have a relative who's has been around a church that I would describe as not being committed to the authority of Scripture. And he went and saw the Narnia, the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And he and I were talking about it, and I said, it's so powerful to me, the resurrection scene. And he had no idea what I was talking about. So we had an opportunity then to talk about why that was a resurrection scene. But for Lewis, he used both, this direct presentation of the gospel and then also this colorful depiction that makes you long for that to be true. I think it's Lisa Miller. She's the founder of Salon.com. Which is far from a conservative Christian, platform. Yeah. But she read the Narnia stories as a child and loved them. And then as an adult, she was asked to go back and write an essay about her favorite story from her childhood. And so she went back to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and she said it really angered her because she hadn't picked up on any of those Christian themes. And she said, but what spoke to her in the Narnia stories and what she still appreciated in different ways, although she said she really despised Lewis's kind of hidden Christian evangelistic, She said, but
Lewis and Tolkien would be great if it weren't for that Christianity.
That's right. Yeah, on the one hand we say that.
Other than that, the rest is fine, as if there's anything left over.
That's right. And that's right. And she said, but what spoke to her is this longing for these kind of categories for meaning in life, that spoke to her, even though as an atheist now she recognized that there aren't those kind of things aren't real. And I think that is maybe a key to understanding Lewis's apologetic, that he was able to understand the human condition, what are we longing for, and then either directly or through these stories to show ways that the gospel actually comes into our storyline and completes our storyline, what we're longing for. The gospel actually gives us categories for them, things like evil, how do we understand what's really evil, what's really good. Christianity explains that, but it does even better, if it's true, it gives us a solution to evil, which is of course Jesus' atonement for our sins. So I think Lewis, in his diverse use of different methods, has so much to teach us in different contexts and also in different times in the same context.
What if you think? I mean, I know I'm asking you to just kind of imagine, but you've studied his life, you've studied his writings, you've taught him in the classroom. What if Lewis was to speak to cross-cultural missionaries, you think, and say, this is how you can use story to make an impact in a culture? What kind of advice do you think he would give to our missionaries that are that are, dealing with very different cultures and trying to find unique ways and powerful ways to communicate the gospel. What do you think he might say about story?
Wow. Of course, he wrote some essays that would kind of unpack that, and he would argue that sometimes the very best way to tell something is through a story, that sometimes to really convey something, you have to capture the imagination. And so I'm reluctant to say this is what I think Lewis would say, just because there would be...
that wouldn't be fair, but...
Yeah. So I think that what he would encourage people to do is probably to be faithful in every opportunity the Lord allows us to point people to Jesus. And Lewis was used hospitality in such powerful ways. I mean, even the Narnia stories that begin with these children fleeing London for Oxford, which actually happened in real life. Right. The children fled from London to Oxford, and this professor who's welcoming kids in, Lewis, during this time, welcomed kids into his home. And so I think that Lewis would say, be faithful over those things. And for people who are gifted at as storytellers, to tell a really good story. But to use the power of that story is going to fit within these Christian worldviews. Like you said, they would be great if it wasn't for their Christianity. And we joke about that because we know that it's actually Christianity that gave a framework for the power of their story.
Michael Jordan would be great if it weren't for all the basketball.
That's right. That's right. But even outside of it's interesting. Even outside of Christian storytellers, secular storytellers borrow this storyline all the time. Yeah. And so to be able to say what makes something like I Am Legend powerful, you have Will Smith at the end who sacrifices himself to save, the people who are left without going into the whole movie. Yeah. And the antidote to, the problem that's happened is in his blood. I remember hearing
Spoiler alert.
That's right. I remember hearing
15-year-old movie,
it's an old movie.
Yeah.
I remember hearing Russell Moore say, I've heard that story before. And to be able to, if you're gifted as a storyteller, do it very well, and don't, Tolkien didn't like how Lewis at times was a bit too explicit. I appreciate both Tolkien and Lewis, and so people are going to be gifted in different ways in telling stories. But if you're not a gifted storyteller, you still have every opportunity, like Lewis did, to use hospitality and relationships and friendships.
And one of the things I love about Lewis, we were kind of talking beforehand about some of the different books. Some of them are academic books, and you brought to mind The Abolition of Man, and really how he talks about the head, the chest, and the belly, and really how the chest or the affections have to be developed well. Yeah. And I feel like Lewis does that for me. Mm-hmm. Like I read things and I love better and I love deeper because I've read his depictions of love. It doesn't just inform my head, but it also helps develop the right kind of affection for Christ. And that's something that a really good storyteller can help us to do. And I think that's
well, and actually, your question to Dan earlier about what would he potentially say to today's missionaries, or we've had a couple conversations here in our time at Cedarville about what's going on with Gen Z and how passionate are they in their faith, those that are believers, and what are we looking at in this generation, which things like Abolition of Man, things like That Hideous Strength, which those two works of Lewis's go hand in hand. Yeah. That breakdown of head, chest and belly. I mean, one of the things that he says is that we're raising in his time, I think even more so now, men without chests. Mm-hmm. And we remove the organ but demand the function. Yeah. And it's interesting, I think as missions mobilizers, we see that, right? There's a part of us that wants to call people up to some very big things for the Lord. And many people rise to the occasion, many people don't. And for so many people, it's because they lack the organ that gives them that chest. Along those lines, I think that those two particular works, Abolition of Man and That Hideous Strength, which is the third in the Space Trilogy, really are kind of prophetic for our day. And we're a missions podcast trying to be missional in our current culture as well. I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on that. It kind of paints this picture of this technocratic society of again, people without the affections that are going to spur them on towards heroism, and what happens is they fall prey to the spirit of the age in various ways. Do you see that playing out in our day?
Yeah, I think that, I was just sharing with my theology students yesterday, the real challenge in doing theology is always that we want the Bible to conform to us instead of us being conformed to it. And if we're not careful, we'll just bring the spirit of the age into our hermeneutics. And so we can, on the one hand, say we love Scripture, we love Jesus, but on the other hand, we could smuggle in all these really bad, vile things. I mean, you think about Jonathan Edwards and John Wesley, who were contemporaries, and one was for slavery and another was against it. And Jonathan Edwards, who was pro-slavery, as high of a view of the Scripture as he had, is a sad reminder that even some of the heroes we might point to brought the spirit of the age into the Bible. And so if we're not letting the Bible confront us, we won't be transformed by it. We'll begin finding ways to allow the ways we want to live to be compatible with the doctrine we're teaching. And I would also say too that when it comes back to developing the chest, the affections, it's not always just about pointing to stories like Lord of the Rings or the Space Trilogy, as great as they are, but to remember that the Bible is mostly narrative, you know? Yeah. And so I think sometimes our teaching, we reduce everything down to the propositions of the epistles, which are beautiful and wonderful, and we forget that, to quote Kevin Van Hooser, the Bible is not a bunch of disembodied propositions. You have these beautiful, rich stories, and I think that that's one of those things that's from another time and place, another culture, and so no matter where you are, that's an inroad to bring story to bear of this redemptive work of God.
Well, and the greatest proposition that we assert, the gospel, is narrative.
That's right.
It's the hero's story.
It's the big meta-narrative.
He dies, he rises, he reigns. Yeah, it has to capture our affections as well. So, last question while we're here together.
Well, I have a question.
Okay, you gave me that look.
Yeah, no,
I didn't know.
No, I was just listening. That's all.
What's the look like? I'm sick of this.
I'll save mine.
No.
I'll save mine.
I want to talk about this as long as Dan will give us, because I love this. And we have no other interviews scheduled. Well, for sure today. Maybe we'll do one more. Yeah. We might bring in the legend Don Callan.
You should do the man on the street interview, just randomly.
Yeah, randomly.
Yeah.
Tell us all the things you know about this. Okay, so your favorite Narnia book, and your favorite non-Narnia.
Non-Narnia Lewis book?
Lewis book.
Okay, so that's easy right now, and it might change a year from now, because it's kind of based on what's going on. But The Magician's Nephew has always been my favorite, and I read it in the ordained way it should be read. I read it in the way it was published, and so I was surprised when I discovered that here's Aslan creating Narnia. I'm like, oh, this is a sequel, and you get to the end of the story, spoiler alert, and you have this young boy who grows up to end up being the professor who welcomes children, from London. So I love that book, and that's my favorite scene in all the Narnia stories is Aslan singing Narnia into being. And then Till We Have Faces is my favorite non-Narnia Lewis book. That's one of those books I read in one sitting, and I was just absolutely captivated.
For listeners who haven't read it, tell us what that's about.
So his wife Joy, who in a previous marriage, with her husband, her previous husband, who wrote movies, was a playwright. She would help him craft story, and she really brought that gift set to their marriage. And Joy really helped Lewis shape a story he had wanted to tell for a long time, which was a retelling of the Cupid myth, which is very like his literary mentor, George MacDonald, gave a retelling of a Hebrew myth. And so Lewis retells the Cupid myth, and I kept waiting for this Aslan character to jump out. I think Tolkien, I don't know Tolkien's thoughts on it, I'm sure we could find it somewhere, probably would have liked it. There's not an explicit Christian message, but you have those kind of categories of Christian thought that are throughout the story. So yeah, I love that one.
What are your favorite? I mean, it doesn't have to be Narnia, but...
I resonate with Magician's Nephew, and actually, and as far as non-Narnia, I would have to go with That Hideous Strength, which is, I think, the hardest to read out of the three. The pacing and the style are very different from the three that are in the Ransom trilogy, but again, I think it's prophetic for kind of where we're at today. I mean, he saw deconstructionism, he saw postmodernism, and all of the sort of the technocratic elite coming out of that. He saw that in his day, when guys like Foucault and others were still writing and beginning to put these ideas into our bloodstream, these toxic ideas.
So I wanted to ask you this question, because I have favorites too.
What are your favorites?
My favorite, and probably my favorite book, period, is The Great Divorce.
Oh yeah.
I love The Great Divorce.
And George MacDonald makes an appearance in that one.
Yes, he does, which is very special. and helps me think deeper and more lovely thoughts about Christ and heaven, and even my own sin, and it's a very good book. And then I really love, am I saying it right, Paralandria? Paralandra.
Yeah.
Paralandra. I want to say
Tomato.
Paralandra.
Yeah.
It's the second book in the Ransom trilogy, the Space trilogy, and I think about it all the time, especially when I'm going through Genesis. And there's a scene there where the devil character, the unman, is trying to tempt the Eve type character, and it's just like, yeah, I think that's exactly what Satan said. It's so perfect and diabolical that you're like, I can imagine how that, and then the beauty of just the crushing of the head.
Can we follow a rabbit trail with that?
Yeah, as long as you just
I'm fine, yeah.
So, sometimes the rabbit trails are the point, right? They lead back. Squirrels, don't chase the squirrels. They just run off. The rabbits are okay, squirrels aren't. So let's chase the rabbit trail just a little bit, because for me, the Space trilogy or the Ransom trilogy really helps give me some handles on redemptive history and missions in a way, actually. And without getting into all of it, and yes, there'll be some spoilers, the idea that all the planets in the solar system, there was a certain order, right? And Earth is this world that fell under.
Don't get Dan started on this planetary.
Well, but here's the thing.
We'll have to bring Michael Ward
Earth fell, right? And fell under the power of its principality, right? Which we would call Satan, right? And no one's heard from Earth in a while. But then since God has come in the person of Christ and has done something on that planet, everything in the solar system is happening differently. So Venus has its Eden moment that you just described, and here's the spoiler alert: 3, 2. You can turn this off. 1. Okay.
The spoiler alert on a 50-year-old
Venus
book.
doesn't fall. Right. Yeah, exactly. Venus doesn't fall.
Right.
Because things are going differently in the world now that Malil has come in the flesh to do all of this. And to me, I think we, as evangelicals, we just have a really kind of disembodied picture of missions. It's just going around telling people this good news. Well, what is this good news? Because the nations all used to go a certain way. God used to give them over to all of their idolatries. But now, but now he's doing something different, right? And he's putting his enemies under his feet. And
it just makes me think of Acts 17, where Paul's contextualizing there and showing us that that God is doing something remarkable now. And it reminds me to bring Dorothy Sayers back into it. She said that the gospel is first and foremost a statement about reality. And so you're exactly right. What we're saying is that this has radically affected the entire cosmos. And whether you're in China or whether you're in Chicago, this has radically altered everything. And there's a way that you can have this insight into how it's changed, why it's changed, where it's headed.
Beautiful.
Yeah. Now the real last question. Is that cool?
Yes.
We good? All right. Away from Lewis just for a minute. We're at Cedarville here. You've been here 5 years?
Yeah.
5 years.
Completed 5 years. I know, isn't that crazy?
Congratulations. That's
Thank you.
awesome.
Yeah.
What most excites you when you look at the student body, you look at the programs, your work, and missions? Missions is really at the blazing heart of this school, which is really exciting to see. So what do you see that excites you?
So when I have the opportunity to talk to people who don't really know Cedarville well, and they say, same question you asked, what's going on at Cedarville? What really excites me here that would be different from Boyce College or Southern or another seminary is the fact that you have 4,000 students pursuing, the vast majority of them are pursuing liberal arts degrees. A very small percentage of students on campus are Bible majors. I think around 2% of the student body are actually ministry majors. And so out of 4,000, we have 150-ish.
So it's less than 2%. Does that make them an unreached people group? I don't know.
But what excites me is when I teach, I have 150 theology students this semester. And I might have 3 or 4 ministry majors in that group. And so you have people who are going to do business, engineering, medicine, go down the whole spectrum. They're going to be teachers. They all love the Lord. They go to chapel every day at 10 a.m. If they didn't love the Lord, they would hate doing that. But you go to chapel and our students don't hate chapel. They love chapel. And they're all getting 15 hours in biblical theological studies. They all take 5 classes in Bible and theology. And so the opportunity not to go out and try and fundraise to support them, they're going to have vocations that pay them well. They're going to go all over the world. So whether it's partnering with church planting in North America, or whether it's partnering with international missions, our students are going to have the means and the method to take the gospel around the world, and they're ready to do that. And so that's what excites me the most. Over, if I was at a Bible college like I previously was, everybody there is going to work for a church, and we need people to do that. But this opportunity to send people to all these different business platforms it's remarkable.
You can't live in a Christian ghetto.
That's right.
Culturally, yeah.
Yeah, and our students get it. I mean, they have a passion, and their college kids are imperfect, but there's something unique happening, as our president, Dr. White, often says, here in the middle of the cornfields in Ohio, and I'm really excited about it.
Dan, we're excited about it too. How can people follow you?
So on Twitter, it's just at Dan DeWitt, and then I have a blog where I publish about C.S. Lewis and sundry other things, and it's called theolate.com.
And you also have you have several books published.
Yeah.
Christ in Chaos, Jesus
or Nothing.
Yeah. I almost said Jesus over everything, but yes, Jesus or Nothing.
Right.
And some children's books, The Owlings. I mean, you've written a lot, and I've enjoyed them all. What's the new book you've got coming out?
So I've got a new book that's due at the end of this calendar year. So I don't know when it'll be out, but it's with B&H Kids, and it's on C.S. Lewis.
Awesome.
So, and that'll be fun. I have another book I'm working on for New Growth Press, and it's going to be called Sketchy Views, A Beginner's Guide to Making Sense of God, His Word, and His World.
Is it going to be your art?
It's going to be my art and my writing. So it's the first time I've had the opportunity to do that for a publisher. So that will be out sometime next year. But it's essentially my theology class I teach here at Cedarville, basically that in book form.
Well, and if you love, especially Inklings, I think that people would love your art. And where can they find some of those sketches and stuff that you've done?
At Theolate.
It's there.
Yeah.
So very fun.
Lot espresso, a man after my own heart.
It's like theology in Starbucks. You get what I
coffee.
mean. And coffee.
Yes.
Good coffee.
If C.S. Lewis was a Baptist, he would have drank a lot of coffee.
He is now. He is now.
That's right.
And with that, follow Dan DeWitt. Thank you for what you're doing here at Cedarville. To get more content, go to missionspodcast.com. To support the show, go to missionspodcast.com/support. And remember to not only subscribe, but rate and review. That'll get this content in front of other people who can be blessed by it. Until next time, thanks for listening.